Greetings from the University of South Florida. Thank you for joining us. This is our second installment on the future of warfare from the Global and National Security Institute. I'm Rob Burrell, and today I will be interviewing Dr. Chris Mason, a senior non-resident fellow here at GNSI. Chris is the scholar who developed the study of internal conflict, which you can access on our USF website. We are going to discuss this provocative study, how it came about, and how it can be used going forward for predictive analysis in understanding insurgencies and civil wars. We have more people registered for this webinar than we have ever had before. Thank you for attending. This includes many national security professionals in the State Department, as well as academia. We are very interested in your questions. So for those who would like to participate in the conversation, on your Zoom app, there is a Q&A button on the bottom. Hit that tab and write your questions in, and I will be able to see them from here. And we will answer as many of those as we can get to. Okay, now for introductions. Dr. Chris Mason is a U.S. Navy veteran and a retired Foreign Service officer with the State Department. He is also a retired professor of National Security Affairs at the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College. He holds a master's degree in military studies from Marine Corps University and holds a PhD in military and Central Asian history from George Washington University. Chris, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Rob. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm glad to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Chris, can you tell everyone what the study of internal conflict is and how this kind of evolved and came about?
Sure. The study itself is a use of regression analysis of using case studies to determine why governments actually lose internal conflicts. In a nutshell, the definitions and the formatting and so on are a good deal more complex than that. But it grew out of my work and experience in Afghanistan, beginning in the summer of 2001, before the terrorist attacks of September 11th. And my own experiences on the ground in Afghanistan, observing the effects of U.S. policy versus what we thought in Washington those policies were affecting. I was astonished by the disconnect between what U.S. policy in Afghanistan was intended to create and build out in terms of creating support for the government of Afghanistan and what was actually happening on the ground. And as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq began to go sideways, there were a lot of competing theories and ideas and arguments about why that was happening. And as I saw some of the similarities to the conflict in Vietnam in the 1960s and beginning of the 1970s, I began to wonder if we couldn't use actual statistical analysis to figure out exactly why governments were losing, using correlation of political science factors across a broad spectrum of those elements, political, military, economic, geographical, social, cultural, that seem to pop up over and over again in internal conflicts and government defeats. So when I left the State Department and got to the Army War College, I launched the study of internal conflict in 2014, trying to find a way forward to use statistical analysis to determine what was actually going on in these conflicts. The results in the end, I think, were pretty surprising. It certainly surprised me.
Right. Okay. So you pick certain case studies. I mean, you have 50 odd case studies that you've selected to do analysis on. What were the constraints, or how did you figure out these are the 53 that you were going to use as a model?
Sure. Well, we had a fairly limited bandwidth at the Army War College in terms of how many researchers we could apply to the problem over a given period of time. So we started with the Correlates of War database, conflict database, which is comprehensive, and that provided an enormous quantity of internal conflict. So we started with the end of World War II, 1945, as a good starting point for analyzing modern conflict because of the ways in which the end of World War II shaped the modern world. And then we applied some filters to that. It had to be a purely internal conflict, not an international conflict, although many times proxy forces, proxy countries are internationalized in the sense of foreign countries getting involved in other people's wars. But that did not rule out a conflict for consideration in the study. The government, however, the government of the country did have to be a party to the conflict to determine whether or not the government lost, obviously. And not all internal conflicts are, in fact, efforts to gain political power over an existing government. There are a lot of internal conflicts which are just two groups of citizens of a country fighting each other for other reasons, not seeking political power. So the insurgent group or the rebelling element had to be seeking political power in the country, either all of the power at a national level or creating a breakaway regime like Kosovo or East Timor, for example, Bangladesh. And then that still left us with a very large number of conflicts, and we needed to find some way to filter that to some extent. And one of the reasons I'm really looking forward to the transition of the study of internal conflict here to GNSI and the University of South Florida is, I think, a great opportunity to expand this research now and maybe turn down some of our filters that had to be set as high as they did because of the limited number of researchers that we had at the beginning of the project. Now we can look at many more conflicts than we did. One of the filters that we had to apply was the intensity of the conflict, the number of people involved in the conflict and the number of casualties in the conflict. And we decided that we would set that threshold at 1,000 persons killed in any continuous 12-month period during the conflict. That would include civilians, security forces, and insurgent forces combined, not in a calendar year, but in any continuous 12-month period. And that left, among the conflicts that had ended, because we want to know if the government had won or lost, that left about 60 odd conflicts from the Correlates of War database. We decided to rule out wars of colonial liberation because those were kind of a gray area in which a European power was really trying to maintain hold of a colonial possession. So that was, in a sense, more of an international war than a purely internal conflict. And then a number of those 60 conflicts were subsequently found not to really meet those criteria. And in the end, we wound up with 53 conflicts. And each of the conflicts was analyzed through a case study in a double-blind format by two researchers working independently, so they would not influence each other's results. But we actually did close to 120 case studies, 106 of which ultimately went into the database. 53 conflicts studied twice. And then we often got the question at briefings, well, what about Northern Ireland?
Right.
Because it's such a well-known conflict. And when I would give the answer, well, it didn't meet the criteria, I could see, people sort of drifting away from the conversation. So we actually did two case studies of the conflict in Northern Ireland, although at no time did the casualty numbers, as tragic as they are from the Troubles in the UK during that conflict, reach 1,000 casualties. We did it just because we got asked about it so often. It's popular.
Okay, so you do 53 case studies. I mean, that's a really large number. You've got doing those almost, double those with different The study came up with some pretty decisive results, right? So what exactly are the conclusions of the study?
Well, I guess we have to go back to the parameters of the study itself and what we were looking for to establish the statistical basis for government defeat, to create a set of independent variables. If the dependent variable in the regression analysis was government defeat, what were the independent variables that could impact the dependent variable? And we developed a list of more than 60 different factors that could conceivably have an impact on government success or failure in an internal conflict. Almost everything that we could think of went onto the list for consideration: maternal mortality, infant mortality, poverty rates, literacy rates, type of terrain, predominant religions, cultural factors, the type of terrain, mountain terrain versus a flat terrain, jungle versus mountain in habitations. Everything we could think of. And more than 60 different factors were tested to see which ones correlated with government defeat at least 90% of the time. And as you would expect, the great majority of those factors clustered around the mean. Virtually all of the 60 plus factors that were tested in the 53 conflicts were somewhere between 40% and 70% correlation with government defeat. And of course, 50% correlation would just be a coin toss. If a factor is present half the time and it's not present the other half of the time, it's the definition of random. And that's what I expected to find when this started out now 11 years ago. But what was really surprising was that out of those 60 factors, there were 5 that clustered above 90%.
Wow.
And a significant gap. Now, if you looked at a scatter graph of all of those things graphed out, it was sort of an oval around the 50% mean. And then there was a group of 5 at the very top that just jumped out. And I had not expected to find that when the research began. So we went back and tested it over and over with the case studies, looking to see if we could disprove this. And it turns out that there are 5 factors that correlate with government defeat in almost every case. Now, not all of them are always present in a government defeat. There could be 1 present, there could be 5 of those factors present. But in regression analysis, when multiple factors are present, we cross multiply those, and the possibility of a government surviving 2 of the negative factors working against it is statistically close to nil. And when you get above 2 negative factors, 3, 4, even 5 negative factors, there is statistically no probability of that government being victorious. And most of those factors, at least 3 of the factors, are not susceptible to government action during the course of the conflict. That was one of the most exciting things, one of the most interesting things that we found in the study, was that at least 2 of the factors were not susceptible to government action after the start of the conflict. The 5 factors that correlate with government defeat at least 90% of the time are legitimacy of governance, the extent of the population that expresses a national identity, the percentage of the population that the government is able to sequester from contact with insurgents. In other words, build a firewall between the insurgent group and its civilian population. A cross-border sanctuary for insurgent groups, whether they can literally walk across a land border and get sanctuary in a neighboring country, free from prosecution or pursuit. And then the 5th factor we don't see very often. It's kind of you could almost make it an asterisk, and that is whether or not there was a standing army or standing security forces under government control at the start of the conflict. And because virtually every country on earth has a standing army, this factor doesn't come into play very often. Costa Rica is one example I can think of a conflict in 1948 that did not have any standing security forces at the time in 1948. But when it does come into play, it is invariably fatal. for the government to not have standing security forces. And the two that we can think of, right off the bat, are Iraq and Afghanistan.
Sure.
Where Iraq had an army, but it was disbanded on U.S. government orders, and we attempted to create another one, which was a catastrophic failure. And Afghanistan, where there was no army when we arrived, and we tried to create one. Where there is not a standing army, the government invariably loses. Now, the levels of correlation here are important. Interestingly, what we found after testing percentage levels at different degrees was that the number that kept coming up was 85% correlation, or 85% of the population affected. So, for example, government legitimacy. We found that when less than 85% of the population of a country believed the government that was in power to be legitimate, the government lost 94% of the conflicts. When less than 85% of the population of the entire country, not just the insurgent zone, but the entire country, expresses a belief in a national identity, places their own sense of personal identity at the national level, the government loses 96% of the time. For example, I would say I'm an American, or a person would say I'm Peruvian, or I'm Nigerian. When that sense of national identity is not present, at least 85% of the population, it's fatal to the government 96% of the time. When the government protects less than 85% of its population from meaningful contact with the insurgent forces, the government loses 100% of the time. Interestingly, Mao Zedong determined this number back in the 1930s.
Wow.
In his treatise on guerrilla warfare, he notices that when insurgents get support from more than 15% of the population, or can interact with more than 15% of the population, it's almost impossible for a government to win. And we found that it's statistically impossible for a government to win unless they're able to create an air gap between the insurgents and the population. Now, a lone terrorist can get through and set off a car bomb, or plant an IED once in a while. But what we're talking about is the ability of insurgents to interact on a regular basis with the population, to collect taxes, get support in the form of new recruits, or food supplies from the civilian population, hide among the civilian population, proselytize the civilian population. But when the government is able to actually protect the population from that kind of contact, then there's a possibility of government victory. Cross-border sanctuary and whether or not there was a standing army are just Boolean factors. Either there is or there isn't. Interestingly, only two of those things are susceptible to government action during the course of the conflict, and that is the cross-border sanctuary and population security.
Yep.
Governments can use security forces and international diplomacy to cut off cross-border sanctuary,
sure,
limit cross-border sanctuary in militarily meaningful numbers. Of course, we had to define each one of these very precisely so that we were comparing apples to apples all the way through. But what was fascinating, one of the most interesting results that we found by doing cross-sections during of the factors during extended conflicts, 15, 20, 25-year conflicts, was that the sense of national identity and the sense of legitimacy of governance never increased during an internal conflict, no conflict since 1945. The level of national legitimacy that you have and the level of national identity that you have at the start of the conflict can remain the same, or it can go down depending on government actions. A good example of that was the war in Guatemala, when the government in Guatemala very unwisely decided to target the ethnic Mayan population of Guatemala because they perceived that the Mayan ethnic minority were sheltering or supporting the insurgents, and they began a pogrom against the Mayans. many of whom believed themselves to be Guatemalan and believed the government to be legitimate until such time as the government started attacking them. And then we saw the development of a more Mayan sense of identity,
Right.
and a decrease in their belief that the government was legitimate. So those things can go down
Right.
if the government acts unwisely, but they can never go up. We found no correlation, and we spent years looking for some evidence that efforts to increase government legitimacy, typically reconstruction programs, development programs, which are designed to create a sense of legitimacy for the government among rural populations, none of them ever produce that effect. And what we found a good deal of evidence to the contrary, that those programs at best would have no effect
Wow.
on government legitimacy, but in many cases actually had a negative effect on legitimacy because the programs were poorly designed or they weren't carried out, or there's a lot of theories on why that might be the case. Perhaps the civilian population has to make a calculation based on their own survival.
Right.
And if they're going to get the benefit of that development project anyway, there's no real need to choose sides, given that it's not going to affect the outcome. But I think more than anything, what that showed us was that the U.S. American sense of where legitimacy comes from, and this transactional relationship between the population and the government, is a very culturally based concept, and many populations, much of the world does not derive legitimacy of governance from governments delivering goods and services, building schools or building hospitals or roads. That's just not where legitimacy comes from. And a government bringing those things to a rural population has never been found to increase legitimacy of governance through studies, polling, research into public opinion before and after these projects were completed, shows that they have never increased the sense of legitimacy of governance anywhere in the world in all 53 of those conflicts since 1945. That was kind of a remarkable subset of the findings, but it has profound implications for counterinsurgency and counterinsurgency doctrine. What it says essentially is that clear, hold, and build doesn't work. If you can clear and hold, but building things doesn't change the perception of the population, the civilian population for its government. So if they don't have that effect, and there's no evidence anywhere, no statistical evidence that this has ever been effective, then we have to question why do that,
Right.
if it has no positive effect. So those were the 5 factors that jumped out, and it's fascinating to in the case studies to look at which factors cluster together. National identity and government legitimacy are so closely entwined that we call them the twins in the study, because they're found they so often move algebraically together. There are case studies where one was true but not the other, but typically they're
hand in hand.
They're linked.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, that's what we found. The actual parameters for what we call external sanctuary were pretty tightly defined. It's not one guerrilla crawling under the barbed wire, occasionally and avoiding searchlights, but at least a rifle squad-sized presence of guerrillas being able to cross the border, for example, in good military order with their weapons, almost always free of any sort of government intervention. A good example of that would be the Taliban crossing the border into Pakistan. So we defined each one of these independent variables pretty discretely, and you'll find those definitions in the methodology and the glossary and the case studies on the website. So we wanted to make sure that researchers were comparing and making evaluations of whether or not these 5 factors were present in each one of these case studies using identical sets of parameters and definitions.
Great. Yeah, that was a lot. So I got a great question here from Frank Rivas. Hey, can you show a link to the details? So I just want to mention to everyone out there that if you go on the GNSI website, you can see all of the 53 case studies. It has links to every single one of those case studies. So go to the University of South Florida Global and National Security Institute. You can find the study of internal conflict, and you'll see all that. Also, Dr. Mason just published in a new book from Joint Special Operations University called Resiliency and Resistance. He's got a whole chapter in there. He's got that great diagram which shows the shot pattern of the 60 factors, and then the five factor analysis that are up on top of that screen. So those are 2 links you can look at. Is look at the new book on the JSOW University site, or go to GNSI and check out the all 53 studies that are on there. So thank you for that question. Keep the questions coming in. I got a bunch of them on here. So you did mention that the study of internal conflict could have an impact on future doctrine within the military. How could this help with research? How could using the 5 factors help folks who are interested in studying internal conflict? Where could it go past the 53 studies that you mentioned?
That's a great question. When this initially began in 2014, my idea was to create a kind of rubric that would help decision makers, strategic leaders, determine how the U.S. might engage in conflicts abroad. And that came out of my work on Afghanistan, because I thought if we could have a decision tree that would evaluate certain criteria in a foreign country, determinative of outcomes, it would help us avoid quagmires like the Vietnam War or Iraq or Afghanistan. And I was struck in the early days of research on this, as early as 2007, the similarities at the strategic level of war between the conflicts in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. And I began to try to puzzle out what those similarities were, and then create a rubric that would allow decision makers to apply objective research in a set of factors and determine what the outcomes would be. And it was remarkably effective, far more than I expected as a statistical analyst, far more determinative than I expected it to be.
And you have that rubric in your chapter in the book as well.
We do. And it's important, I think, to understand the entire theory. We can only sort of touch the tip of the iceberg here in this program.
Right.
It's not, for example, necessary for all 5 of the factors to be against the government for the government to lose. If one of the factors, depending on which one, is present, however, or is against the government, say, for example, national identity. Yeah. If national identity is below 85%, we know that the government will lose 96% of the time. So we can project a 96% probability of government defeat in a current conflict or a future conflict where national identity is below 85%. But if at the same time a second factor is present, the way statistical analysis works is we cross-multiply those 2 morbidity factors. So if a 94% probability of defeat and a 96% probability of defeat are both present in a conflict, that means there's virtually statistically no chance of government success if 2 factors are present. So we have found outliers where one factor was present when it was in the 4% where the government did manage to win, or the 6% where the government did manage to win. But when 2 or more factors are present, no government has succeeded in defeating that insurgency and remained in power. So 2 factors or more are universally fatal, and of course, multiple factors, 3, 4, 5, mean for decision makers that's
Right.
not a place we'd want to put boots on the ground, and our support should perhaps take another form. Afghanistan is a great example of.
Yeah, can you go over the 5 factors with Afghanistan? Because I got a question here from Gary Lamb. They want you to circle back on exactly the 5 factors. So maybe Afghanistan is a great example.
It is a great example.
Go through those 5 factors.
Sure. First of all, national identity. Afghanistan, from my work as an Afghanistan expert beginning in 2001, I think we could place confidently at about 5% of the population. There are more first languages spoken in Afghanistan, by which I mean sort of the language spoken at the dinner table at night. There are more first languages spoken in Afghanistan than there are in Europe.
Wow.
It's not a nation, and it probably never will be. And nowhere close to 85% of the population of Afghanistan would say, I'm Afghan. They would say, I'm Tajik, or I'm Hazar, I'm Uzbek, I'm Pashtun, I'm Baloch, what have you. So there's a case where it's easy to determine that national identity in Afghanistan is well below 85%. Government legitimacy, again, we know from a large body of polling and research that the government in Afghanistan never even approached 15%. The Karzai government and then the Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai government probably hovered around 10% legitimacy, and that would be their own constituencies. The Ahmadzai clan of the Khalji Pashtuns, for example, supported Ashraf Ghani because he was from that clan, and we know that he got about 3% of the potential possible vote in the final election in Afghanistan. So there's a broad statistical basis for determining that Afghanistan never came anywhere near 85% legitimacy of governance, and probably never approached even 20%. Okay. A more reasonable number might be 10 to 15% at best. Cross-border sanctuary, I can't think of a better example in the history of insurgency than the Taliban's access to cross-border sanctuary in Pakistan.
Yeah.
Now, I should point out that external support, external intervention is not necessary for sanctuary to exist. External support, international support from, for example, Pakistan, the Pakistani government to the Taliban, is not necessary for that factor to apply. It's simply the ability of an insurgent in a rifle squad size unit or more to walk across the border with their weapons and be largely free from pursuit or prosecution in the country they're going to. So was there external sanctuary for the Taliban? I think we can definitively say that there was. The Pakistani government supported them throughout the war, as a number of American military and political leaders pointed out. They were receiving support from Pakistani intelligence services in the form of money, weapons, medical care, and so on. All of the Taliban's families were relocated to the area around Quetta, where they received support from the Pakistani government. So there was broad-based sanctuary and external support for the Taliban in Afghanistan. Did we protect 85% of the population of Afghanistan from any meaningful contact with Taliban? Obviously not. 85% of the population of Afghanistan was rural. About 15% of the population was urban, which grew with the refugee displacement of parts of the rural population into larger cities like Kandahar and Kabul and Herat. But even at the end of the war, about 80% of the population of Afghanistan was and remains rural. And I don't think we came close to protecting 85% of the rural population of Afghanistan from contact with the Taliban in the form of proselytizing, in the form of taxation, the form of getting recruits from the rural population. I think at best in Afghanistan, we might have protected 20% of the rural population, maybe even 30%, but you need 85% to prevent a government defeat at 100% probability. And was there a standing army? Before that, no, clearly there was not. Right. Afghanistan had an army in the 1980s and into the early 1990s, but when we arrived there, obviously there was no standing army, and we tried to create one. So there's a case where all 5 factors were against the Afghan government, and statistically, on day one, there was no possibility of a successful outcome in terms of achieving our U.S. foreign policy objectives in Afghanistan. The same could be said of Iraq as well.
Yep.
And in evaluating the war in South Vietnam, I think the only one of the 5 factors that we could say was present in South Vietnam was existing security forces. The ARVN, the Army Republic of Vietnam, was a standing force at the time the U.S. decided to put troops ashore at Da Nang in 1965. It had only been in existence for about 10 years, but I think on balance, we would give the benefit of the doubt to the South Vietnamese government as having established security forces. But in Vietnam, 4 out of the 5 defeat factors were present for the government, and that I think the outcome there was preordained as well because of these political military factors at the strategic level of war.
That's great. I love the Afghan example, and you went through that very well. I know you're really familiar with that. There's another question here that is important because it's sometimes it's confusing when you're thinking about all these factors and you're also thinking about the framework of a society, right? So you've got different ethnic, religious, linguistic factors that are in all societies. Look at America; it's a very diverse society. So how are those factors different from what you're saying is identity or legitimacy? I mean, how do we separate those two things so that we know the difference? So I'm not just looking at ethnicity in the U.S. and it makes up something of the 5 factors. I mean, obviously it's not, right? So there's something different about those two things.
Well, national identity as a political science concept is defined as a group of people with a shared identity, simply, and that can come from any one of those factors that you just laid out. It could come from ethnicity, it could come from language, could come from religion. There are examples of national identity around the world that are based on each one of those, and sometimes a combination of those. So ethnicity, language, religion, all of these things play a role in the development of this sort of supra concept of national identity. France, for example, would be a country that has a strong national identity that's based largely on culture and language. The French, in terms of DNA, aren't significantly different from Germans. And yet, France and Germany are distinctly 2 nations with a strong sense of national identity. Japan is another example of a country with a very strong national identity, which at times in history has been problematic for the world.
Right.
But identity could come from anywhere. The largest nation in the world are the Kurds that don't have a country. A nation doesn't mean a territory. It means a group of people with a shared identity. The Kurds would clearly identify as a nation, and yet they don't have a territory to inhabit. That there's no Kurdistan, and perhaps there will not be because of the political factors pertaining in the Middle East and the countries that the Kurds inhabit. And there are examples of countries that contain multiple nations, you might say. Canada, for example, has both a Francophone nation centered in Quebec and an Anglophone nation centered outside. And there's a case where 2 nations coexist in one country successfully. Belgium is another example.
Sure.
The 2 the French-speaking and Dutch-speaking populations don't necessarily interact all that much, but Belgium is certainly a successful country, been at peace with itself for centuries. So differences in identity, political identity, religious identity, linguistic identity aren't necessarily divisive, but they can be.
Yeah. Okay, great. That's a great example of the complexity there. So again, another question here, and this kind of circles back on some of the things you discussed, but I'm sure folks are trying to grasp everything. So you talk about the 5 factors that are important, and you cover this a little bit, but which factors can the government influence going forward in a conflict, and which factors can the resistance influence going forward in a conflict? If they were going to focus on those 5 factors, which factors can the government say, I need to influence these? Or which factors can the resistance say, these are the levers I need to pull to be successful?
That question goes right to the heart of the study and the value of the study for decision makers. There are only 2 of the 5 factors that are susceptible to government action after the shooting starts, and that is cross-border sanctuary and protection of the population from contact with the guerrillas. As I said at the beginning of the program, national identity has never increased in any internal conflict since 1945 that we have studied. It can go down, as was the case in Guatemala, as I cited earlier, or it can remain the same, but it cannot go up. And that's critically true of legitimacy of governance. Legitimacy of governance can remain the same if the government does everything right, or it can go down if the government uses heavy-handed security tactics, if there are massacres of civilian population and so on. It does go down, but it has not ever gone up. Because it's not in almost all these countries, it's not a transactional sense of legitimacy of governance. We'll build it and you will give us your loyalty, or you will believe us to be legitimate. So the 2 things that a government can do in an internal conflict is protect the population, because if it doesn't protect at least 85% of the population, as I noted earlier, the insurgency eventually wins 100% of the time. So you can increase through population protection, population-centric security efforts. You can increase the percentage of the population that you're protecting from exposure to the guerrillas. You can create a firewall between the population and the insurgents. And you can make an effort to eliminate cross-border sanctuary, which is notoriously difficult to do. The border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, as the crow flies, was perhaps 600 miles, but on the map, it was over 1,200 miles of much of it impassable terrain, and there were hundreds of cross-border trails used by smugglers and guerrillas. And it was a practical impossibility given the troop-to-task ratio in Afghanistan to close that border. But there are cases where government has been able to successfully close off a land border where that land border was relatively short. The border, for example, between what then was Malaya and Thailand was a relatively narrow strip of land example on that peninsula. So those are 2 things that are susceptible to government action. But if at the start of the conflict there is no national identity at the 85% level and there's no government legitimacy at the 85% level, the government's going to lose. And what that should mean is that the government should start negotiating, because they can either begin negotiating with the insurgent group, or there can be a long and bloody war, and then they can negotiate.
Okay.
And the longer the war goes on, the harder it is to achieve a peaceful negotiation outcome.
Awesome. Hey, I got another question here from Dr. Ken Glyman at Arizona State, and we've talked about this question together, looking at the study of internal conflict going forward. What do you anticipate is going to happen if you take that one criteria that you used? You had to have 1,000 deaths in a year, right? For it to meet the criteria of these, the 5-factor analysis that came up. What will happen when you start lowering that constraint on case studies? What do you anticipate? I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think might happen?
I'm excited about that question, and it's really the reason why I'm happy about the relocation now of the study of internal conflict to the University of South Florida, because it will give us the opportunity to explore that. And I hope now that we've established it here at GNSI, people can use these factors, and if applied, in using the methodology of the program, we can begin to explore that question. I think what we'll find is that it reinforces the sense of outcome. Using the largest and most intense conflicts for the beginning of the study, for the first 53 case studies, meant that those were going to be the conflicts that were most difficult for the government to resolve successfully. The less intense the conflict, I think, the greater the possibility of a successful government outcome. And I wondered about that exactly impact on the data. But by definition, if more than 1,000 people are being killed in a year,
Yeah.
it means it's a very intense conflict. And the more intense the conflict, the less likely the government is, to succeed. I think the statistics bear that out. But for the case study that we did on Northern Ireland, for example, also that was well below the 1,000 casualty threshold, and the statistics bore that out, the outcome as well. Every one of the 53 case studies that's been done bears out the five-factor model as a way of predicting the possibility of government success with almost 100% statistical accuracy.
Okay, great. So you and I just published recently on Myanmar, right? And that's an ongoing conflict. It hasn't been resolved. You used the five-factor analysis on Myanmar to try to get a gauge on if the military junta was going to be able to survive the civil war, insurgency, however it's being characterized. What are your thoughts on Myanmar going forward and using the five-factor analysis? What do you think is going to happen in that conflict?
Yeah, the conflict in Myanmar is the oldest and longest running civil conflict in the world today. As you know, it began immediately after the end of World War II, when Myanmar was Burma, and has been raging for 80 years ever since. It's a tragic conflict. But the very length of the conflict period itself tells us a number of things about that conflict. And that is, in terms of applying the five factors model, we can predict that there's not going to be a peaceful, lasting outcome in Myanmar. There hasn't been one for the last 80 years. There have been any number of peace negotiations and power sharing models and so on that have been implemented and have all collapsed. Within a fairly short period of time, the country has lapsed back into civil war after a year or two or five of an interbellum of conflict because of the persistence of the five factors there. Clearly, Myanmar is not a nation.
Yeah.
With the Kachin and the Burmans and other ethnic groups that are there, place their sense of personal identity at a more localized or a more regional identity. There is very little sense that of people saying I'm Myanmarese.
Right.
For example, people would say I'm Kachin or
Sure.
I'm Rohingya or what have you. So we can see that's far below the 85% threshold. Government legitimacy, I think it's clear that the current junta ruling in Myanmar has nothing approaching 85% legitimacy at best. It's popular among the Burmans. In central Myanmar, it might be, let's say 40%. The benefit of the doubt, let's say it's even 50%. It's not, it doesn't approach 85%, and it's not going to. Population protection, obviously, again, I doubt that the junta is protecting even 35 or 40% of the population of Myanmar from contact with any of the multitudinous insurgent groups, guerrilla groups that are operating in Myanmar, sometimes cooperating together, sometimes even in conflict with each other. But we're not getting close to population protection. In Myanmar, cross-border sanctuary, I think, is not relevant because there's internal sanctuary.
Yeah.
Where these ethnically based insurgent groups are operating are impervious to government entry, and government forces just simply can't operate there.
Yeah.
Could there be external sanctuary? There could possibly be into India or Bangladesh or even into China, but it's not really a factor in this case. And was there an army at the start in 1945? Well, there was a British army with some Burmese units, like Burmese rifles and so on. But if we were to be, generous in evaluating this and giving the benefit of the doubt to the government, I think we could say there was a standing army at the beginning of the conflict, primarily of Burman ethnic identity. But so Of the five factors, at best, we could say two were in favor of the government, simply because the external sanctuary is not a factor. There's internal sanctuary, and we could say the government had an army. So I don't think there's any possibility of a peaceful outcome in Myanmar, short of doing what was done to resolve the conflict in Yugoslavia and applying that, the Dayton Accord model, to Myanmar, and simply acknowledging that Myanmar is not a nation. It's not a successful country, and it's never going to be. And international bodies like the UN and the State Department often fight tooth and nail against the creation of new countries like East Timor, Bangladesh, for example. The State Department and the UN were both against the creation of those new countries until the inevitable, the writing was on the wall. But I think the answer to the conflict in Myanmar is to simply create what was created in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, and allow the separate national identities that currently exist in what is Myanmar today to become independent countries. That creating new maps is by far and away the most successful method of conflict resolution since 1945. We've seen that over and over again in North South Sudan, throughout Yugoslavia, Bangladesh, and East Timor, and so many places. When there's an intractable conflict, the solution is often just to draw a new map, and I think that's the solution in Myanmar as well.
Well, that's a provocative approach that our system of nations since 1945 has resisted. Yeah, and if you want to look at our article that we wrote together on Myanmar, which covers rare earth minerals, by the way, as well, which Myanmar is very rich in, it's in national interest, and you can look that up. There's a couple questions here which I think are very, going back to Dr. Gleiman's question, are also very interesting, which is, could something similar be done for nonviolent resistance? Do you think that, obviously these five factors might not be the ones that are outliers, they pop up, but not only an overthrow, but maybe even change to the government structure? Do you think you could use regression analysis? Harvard's doing a lot of this type of research as well, to look at nonviolent resistance. Dr. Chenoweth at Harvard has written a few books on this, but do you think you could use a similar approach to look at different nonviolent action or different types of nonviolent resistance, and come up with a similar rubric where you can say, oh, these are the decisive factors in government change or government remaining the same?
I think it'd be fascinating to explore that. I think there's reason to believe that you could. There's some research I'm aware of on the percentage of a population of a country that has to be protesting peacefully for policy change before that the policy is affected. U.S. engagement in the Vietnam War, for example, when the support for that war, the domestic support for that war, crossed the Rubicon. The national leadership was really no longer able to successfully prosecute that war. I think the answer is yes. I think it's an exciting question, and I hope that that will be explored. And I would look forward to working with any scholars on
Awesome.
Taking that new avenue of approach. I think it's one of the exciting possibilities that having the study of internal conflict here at GNSI opens up.
All right. Well, Chris, we are coming close to the top of the hour. Thank you so much for sharing everything you have told us about the study of internal conflict and how those lessons can be applied to national security, to future military doctrine, to foreign policy. There's a lot to take in.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rob. And I'm looking forward to moving ahead now with the study of internal conflict here at GNSI and exploring a lot of these questions.
Great. Okay, so I want to thank all the guests for attending this event today. For USF students and faculty, Dr. Mason will be available for questions at 2 p.m. in the Marshall Center. So just find the Legacy Room, which is room 2702. Please come and join us. You can ask Dr. Mason questions in person, and also how you might be able to contribute to new research on the study of internal conflict. For our global audience, stay tuned for our next Future of Warfare episode with Dr. Craig Simons from the U.S. Naval Academy on 27 October as we discuss the Pacific War in World War II, as well as how those lessons can be applied today, possibly in a conflict with China. Thank you all for attending, and go Bulls.